Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The VUU, or the VUU, as some of us here love to call it. We think we might just change the name, QuianaDenae, to the VUU, and just call it that in your honor forever forward. It is great to be here again. We have two more shows before the VUU takes a well-earned summer break, and we will be back with you in September. But we are jam-packing these last two shows with goodness and real amazing guests. So we're just so happy. I'm Michael Tino, part of the lead ministry team of the Church of the Larger Fellowship, who bring you the VUU. And I'm here in Peekskill, New York, in the wonderful Hudson Valley of New York, where it is a slightly less oppressively hot and muggy day than it has been all week today. But it is summer here in New York, and things are blooming, and the bees are buzzing, and the whatchamacallits, the praying mantises are hatching in my garden. So they're these teeny tiny little baby praying mantises, and that makes me happy because they eat the things that I don't like. Aisha Hauser, how are you?
Hi, I'm Aisha Hauser, and I'm in Seattle, Washington, and it pretends to be summer here. We get a day or two here in Seattle, and then we have what's called January, because then it gets cold and rainy. And I had friends here last night from New Jersey who I was really thrilled to, have them use my laundry room because they didn't realize how cold is some words that were thrown around, unlike the East Coast, which I understand is a little bit like an oven some days. So I'm doing well. And QuianaDenae.
Hi. So my name's QuianaDenae. My pronouns are she and her, which is like standard Zoom talk right now. Like if somebody says my name, I'm like, my name and pronouns. That's what you need. Kind of that check-in moment. I am in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and it is, we have this weird thing going for the last 3 days. It has rained in the afternoon. Like at 4 o'clock, clouds come, downpour. And I always manage to have my windows cracked. It's like, oh, it's not going to rain. Crack your windows for air. Yes, it's going to rain. So it's been, fun. I want to just take a moment to acknowledge my mama. I will play this for her later, but it's her birthday. And Anna Lillian in 612, I absolutely love and adore you. And I am the luckiest Kiki fish to have you as a mama fish. So I love you, mama. Oh, and somebody else can go. Reverend Don.
Oh, geez, I gotta follow that. Yeah. So I'm Don Fortune. I am here in South Jersey, which is New Jersey, but it's still south of the Mason-Dixon line, which is a little sort of odd some days. It is sort of muggy. Like Michael said, it's minimally less disgusting outside than it has been, but I'll take it. Yesterday it felt like it was in 95 with 100% humidity. I was thinking about just going to a surgeon and asking to have gills installed. But anyway, it's great here in South Jersey, and I'm going to hand it over to Christina Rivera.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Rivera, she, her pronouns, and special shout out to our longtime listeners and never first-time callers. Stitcheroo and Darby Lockridge are on. I've already said good morning to us in the chat. Please feel free to use that chat. We love it. And I am coming to you today from Augusta County, Virginia, where, it's, the season is drunk. It doesn't know what it wants to be. It's just all over the place. It's cold, it's warm, it's humid, it's, who knows what we're going to get. But the really cool thing is the fireflies / lightning bugs are out in full force. And so every night when I go to sleep, I can look out my window and they're just winking and blinking at me. And it just makes me so happy. I feel like they're doing this little dance for me. And I know that they're doing it for each other, but that's okay because it feels good. So if you call them fireflies or you call them lightning bugs, I'm not going there because I know better than to try and moderate that debate. you would just have to come to my house and see them and be happy with them. And Tanner, you want to say hey?
Thank you, Chris. My name is Tanner Linden. I work for the Church of the Larger Fellowship doing outreach, and the VUU doing technical production. So if you have any comments or questions or feedback or suggestions or want to jump into the conversation, please do so in the comments on YouTube, and then I will make sure our hosts see them and get a chance to read them and respond to them over on Zoom. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're really excited you're here. And if you want to learn more about the Church of the Larger Fellowship, pull out your phone and text the word newish, 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 to 94000. I'll put it in the YouTube comments as well. And we can give you more information about the VUU and worship and all of the wonderful things that we're doing here at the Church of the Larger Fellowship. So please do that, and we hope you enjoy the show. I'll pass it back to Reverend Michael.
Thanks, Tanner. Before we introduce our guest and get into our conversation this week, we like to do what we call the UU Roundup, to note the happy and sad things both that are happening around our Unitarian Universalist world. And so we note with happiness that next week is Meadville Lombard Week, that Meadville Lombard Theological School is presenting a week of very interesting programs that are free and open to anyone who wants to attend them. So enjoy that. Chris, you had something you wanted to share with us?
Yeah, I just I wanted to give a shout out to the religious educators of Unitarian Universalism. It's been a really hard couple of weeks, and in our private Facebook groups, we have I don't think we've gone almost a day or 48 hours maybe without a beloved long-term or short-term religious educators saying that their position has been eliminated generally because of budget shortfalls. And we've also heard of our ordained clergy colleagues who've had a reduction in hours. And so we just want to, give a shout out to folks who are in ministry and trying to give their all at a time that it's really rough. And we know it's hard for congregants. We know it's hard for the boards that are making these decisions. But I want to give a special shout out and acknowledgement for this is the time to use your rainy day endowment fund. That is what it is there for. I know it feels like the pandemic is over. It is not. We are still going to be feeling the economic and physical and cultural and all of the ways in which this pandemic has affected us for years. Please, if you can, reconsider those budget decisions through a lens of equity and covenantal relationship, and do right by the religious educators that are in your congregations.
And I also want to thank you, Chris, add to that. One of the things I've heard anecdotally is that boards are deciding, well, our RE attendance has gone down and therefore that we need to not have religious educators. Here's the thing with that. Investing in religious education programs will be fruitful. And right now is not the time to disinvest because we're still in a global pandemic. I mean, maybe I've heard some things that in the United States we're now maybe in an epidemic or we've moved out of it, but really we haven't. We're still still a part of the earth. And so what needs to happen now is more investment in RE, more investment in religious education as the discussions turn to coming back in the coming months. So it seems counterintuitive, but to disinvest now, it'll become a self-fulfilling prophecy is what'll happen. QuianaDenae?
And I just wanted to chime in as a parent and say, this is when I need the most RE. This is when I need the most support, the most direction, the most input, because as I'm struggling, my kids are struggling and they need a rock to hold on to. They see me holding on to my UU faith and the UU and my practices, and I can impart some of that wisdom to them, but I need help. It's why I'm a part of a community. I don't want to be their only voice. So, and know that my kids and everybody else's kids, if we're not involved in UU right now, re-engaging us at 20, 30, 40, 50 is a whole different exercise. So disinvestment now isn't a disinvestment now, it's a disinvestment later. So you have to decide, do you invest this year knowing in 2050, there will still be the church that you loved, or do you disinvest now knowing you're also disinvesting in 2050? Just putting that out there. I want to get to Dr. Ortega though, because he's got like this kind of hot button, topic that's kind of fresh, and we love that. But also, I'll let you introduce yourself because you're really good at talking about yourself in the best way possible. But I also want to make sure, can you tell us a little bit before you get into critical race theory about Meadville Week, just so folks know how to tap in and use that resource as well?
Okay, so well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you again. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to our time together. So Meadville Lombard Week is an event, it's a week-long event starting on the 13th, in which we are providing a number of opportunities for larger UUs, the larger world UUs and others to really engage with some of the best things that Meadville has to offer. So we have a series of public lectures, a number of fun events, and a workshop. So Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, we have what we call the mini lectures at 6 p.m. Eastern Central Time. Dr. Nicole Kirk is talking about religion and technology. And I think in this time, we have been living a lot through that process. On Wednesday, I'm talking with President Dean Bell. He's the president of Spertus Jewish Institute of Learning. And we're talking about the role of religious education in the public, right? How does religious education contribute to the public good as a whole? And on Friday, then we have a conversation with the UU History and Heritage Society and Collegium, and some of the transformations that are happening there and how Meadville is involved in that process. And I can leave that at that. Tuesday and Thursday at 2 o'clock. Central Time. On Tuesday, we have a knitting circle in which I'm going to be knitting with some of the colleagues at work. So it's a drop-in space and chat. And Thursday, we do a tour of the archives. Saturday is going to be a special event leading myself and Tanny Rogers. We're doing a workshop on rituals of grief and hope. And I think this is kind of important for our time as we think about the new church calendar, right? How do we prepare ourselves and resource ourselves to manage the time of grief that is coming more forcefully as we think how are we re-entering into community, and also how to remain hopeful. Sunday, we have Amigo in the Lombard Pulpit. It's going to be a service that's going to be streamed live at 11 a.m. Central, but those who sign can also get access to the file and use it either on Sunday morning or at a time that is appropriate to them and willing. So our hope is that this is some resources that can be made available for folks to use in a time that is convenient for them. All right.
Before we move on to critical race theory real quick, I want to give a shout out to the Church of Larger Fellowship that passed the 8th principle on Sunday. So yay us. So I want to go ahead.
With over 400 votes cast by mail from our incarcerated UU members who were invited to participate directly in our democratic process, which they were thrilled by and we were thrilled by. So.
Yay. And I was on the phone with Paula Cole-Jones earlier this week, who also indicated that I believe there were 11 other congregations that also passed the 8th principle that very same day as we did. So, and more to come this coming Sunday. So shout out to all of the congregations who are really leaning into the work that we're going to be talking about today.
And that does bring us directly into our topic, because the 8th principle of Unitarian Universalism asks us to engage in accountable anti-racism and anti-oppression work. And there's so much buzz in our society right now about critical race theory, and it has become this sort of buzzword for right-wing folks within our faith and outside of it. And I don't think most people who use those words actually understand what it is. So, Dr. Ortega, I ask you here because I know that you are an expert in this and an educator and might help folks understand, like, what is, let's just start with that. What's the 30-second version of what is critical race theory? What do people need to know?
Actually, before I answer that question, I want to put it in a little bit of a broader context with some of three vignettes, right, to help us think about why it matters for us to think about critical race theory and to be informed, right, about critical race theory. And I say to be informed, there's something in our society and in our movement particularly that we value rationality and debate and rational arguments, but oftentimes we're not informed about what we are debating about. And not being informed create confusions, right, about what is it that we're talking about, and actually end up being an irrational conversation. And for me, it's important then to start framing before defining what critical race theory is, to move a little bit back, right? And I want to do 3 vignettes. One is from the Scarlet Letter, 1850s. Nathaniel Hawthorne in that novel has a chapter, a really short chapter. It's called The Prison Door. And one of the things that he mentioned in that chapter towards the beginning, the narrator says, like, whatever new city, right, people want to establish and whatever their hopes and utopia that they're trying to live into that space, they set 2 plot asides right away, one for the cemetery, right, and one for a prison, right. And I think that that's something for us to consider. It's like, what is it about forming a new city, right, that we first established a cemetery for folks who die and remember the dead, but we also established a prison, right away. And in some ways, it's that self-defeating hope. Like, we know there already is going to be something happening, that some folks are going to be removed from the social culture and society, and there's going to be a place to hold them. Why that happens, right, and how do we get there is part of the question. That's 1850. In 1899, right, W.E.B. Du Bois published The Philadelphia Negro. And it's important to think already all the way back then, because the University of Pennsylvania commissioned that study for Du Bois to go into Philadelphia, right, and study, right, what was happening with Negroes in that particular town. And he presented, right, his finding in the ways in which the Black community, right, was being kind of set aside from opportunities of employment, education, right, success, the ways in which they were putting into competition with white folks, and how they were always kind of losing, but not only losing, right, the opportunity, right, for upward mobility that was hopeful, but also being punished for striving, right. And furthermore, he also presents in the work of how, when you try to present some of this material and some of this finding to a white audience, they will say that's not true, right? It's not happened. It is not possible, right, that we, being a just society, right, who value democracy, who value the personal work to pull yourself out of the bootstrap, that is not possible. So this is 1899, right? So we already have some of that work in 1899. And then I'm going to fast forward, right, to 1996, A Time to Kill, right? And I think I saw that movie in the theaters, and some of you might remember the movie. The character Samuel L. Jackson, right, is accused, right, of possible murdering 2 white folks in the South because they raped his 10-year-old daughter, right? And part of the scene at the end, right, I think if you're a person of color, more than likely you kind of sense what's going to happen, right, and how the argument is going to close. But for a mostly white audience, it's a surprise, right? And in some ways, it's really offensive. But I think hits a chord of saying, it's like, well, in a white society, in a white court of justice, right, and Black life cannot get the justice served. So the argument that the closing argument of the lawyer is saying, there's all these things happening that is unjust, the violence against this little girl, right, the rape, etc. You can think of all that, but now imagine that she's not Black, but she's white, right? And then the court clicks, right, for the folks that an injustice had happened. But in the meantime, as the courtroom, right, and the jury is looking, right, and categorizing this person as Black, right, there's no justice to be found. They have to think of her and her dad as white in order for justice to happen. And I think that those three things, right? Thinking about the ways in which when we organize society, we have to think, quote unquote, about cemeteries and prisons. There's a particular ways with Negroes in Philadelphia, historically speaking, in the study that Du Bois presented, that even though if we provide evidence and finding, right, they're going to be debated because in the white imagination, it doesn't quite fit with how they experience their reality. And finally, the ways in which, right, there's a way in which justice is served differently, right? If you embody a white body, or if you have an embodiment of color, particularly Black, in the United States, right? And these three cases, right, these three examples of vignettes are coming, right, from the United States. So to understand then what critical race theory is to start thinking how this works in society. So I'm going to name first, there's a philosopher, Judith Clark. She's not a critical race theory, which is really useful because she tells us that one of the problems in the United States, particularly in liberalism as constructed in the United States, is that we assume that justice is the real case scenario, right? That we are organized in a democratic society, when justice is the reality. And she argues the opposite is the case. Injustice is the reality. And democracy and freedom and liberty is the ideal case scenario, right? And what she's trying to work through is that some folks have access to that, but not everybody. And when we kind of turn that corner, then we can start asking harder questions, right, about society. So critical race theory. If we want to define it very, very shortly, we have to understand that critical race theory is really interdisciplinary intellectual movement, who is really focused on understanding how the law, like legal theory, impacts economic, educational, political, and social access for people of color and white folks unequally, right? At the very simple, most basics, then they start asking how our notions, our understandings of race, who are really sociological and socially constructed, right? We attach meanings to particular bodies, how that is used then to put a particular systems in place that impact people equally to the detriment of people of color and to the benefit of white folks, right? And how the legal system can do this in such a way that it looks like it's neutral, that is fair, right? Because we can all, quote unquote, have access to the legal system. And I think at the most basic, right, that's what critical race theory tries to argue, right? That there's a particularity in the United States of how our law functions, that it impacts people of color differently than white folks, right? And there's a particular ways that we can prove it. For example, they've been going on since the 19th
Let's slow down, because there's a lot of information.
It's a lot, okay.
I know, I'm like,
all right,
I want to make sure, I want to repeat this back to you because I want to make sure I got it. So, QuianaDenae, do you want to go first or do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I want Chris to go.
So from what you said, just in, and thank you so much for putting it in context, because I think that is hugely important, that it's not just like something that has just, sprung out from nowhere and is all of a sudden in our water. It's been here for a really long time. But what I heard you say when you started to talk about that this is really an interdisciplinary discipline, what that makes me think of is like nobody is going to go to a university or some kind of formal learning institution and say, I want to go to the critical race theory department. What you're talking about is it's a way of looking, if I'm understanding you correctly, so please correct me if I'm wrong. What I understand you to say is that it's a way of looking at the different types of academic disciplines through this critical race lens. Is that right?
I mean, yes, and so
yes.
Since the late 70s or early 80s, right, critical race theory really started within legal studies, right? I think that's the part in which it started. And of course, folks who are coming into legal studies and law right, can come from political science, sociology, politics, economics, right? They're coming from different areas into the field, right? And within legal studies, then it's a particular perspective to understand how our legal system and then function, right, in particular ways to make a number of things happen. And of course, you know, for people of color, we understand that, right? We can think about the Chinese Exclusionary Act, right, and how that worked to control property, right? We can think about, right, all the different legal parameters that needed to be set into place before Brown versus Board of Education happened, right? They didn't happen out of the blue. They were building upon long-standing kind of legal battles to get there. We could think about the Miranda right, right? And one of the things that we need to kind of, for me, is shocking when we think about some of the big cases on civil rights law, right, and civil rights, they're connected to the fights of people of color, right? And I think that's interesting, right? Miranda rights, right? How many people actually know what Miranda rights is about and that it's connected to a person, right? Miranda, a Latino, right, in the South, right? And the way that he intimidated himself, right, because he didn't speak English really well. Right. So, and I think that's kind of, you cannot go to the department and say, I'm studying critical theory, because you can study in English, history, politics, philosophy, women and gender studies, every kind of studies, right? It's going to be
something like the Japanese internment of or concentration of Japanese folks of Japanese descent. That is, you're saying that is made possible through that legal process that then the critical race theory is looking at. How did we make that be a thing that could happen? Right.
And how some particular bodies and a particular group of people will be impacted differently. And I think, I mean, in my own research, I'm thinking about juvenile justice. Right, and we know, right, in terms of statistics, that white teens use a lot more weed than Black and brown teens, right? We know that, but who gets arrested more for possession, right, and who actually serve time, right? So that's really a presupposition, right, of guilt. So if the law is the law and it's neutral, right, we will see that not to be the case, right? More white kids will be going to jail for possession, and that's not true. Right, so we already can see there's a particular kind of discrimination, right, going that is happening through the legal system, right? The application of the law is making it possible. And again, you can access the statistic of the Justice Department, right? This is non-partisan, non-Marxist, right? The Justice Department, Michigan State, University of Michigan keeps the archives and the databases, and you can run that information right through it. It's publicly accessible.
Right. Jump in. Thank you so much. I think one of the things that I'm realizing about the criticism of critical race theory is similar to people not wanting to use the words white supremacy culture, which also was described in academia first, to name reality in the United States, right? And then we can apply it globally, and it's the same with critical race theory. Here is what's happening. And here's how we're quantifying what's happening academically through, here's the proof that race is used as a social, to oppress people and is a social construct. So I want to name, and certainly I would love to hear your thoughts on this, that what I want, especially because this is a Unitarian Universalism centered show, we center liberation, it is important to know that not only do people politically on the right are criticizing and going after critical race. People are even like, don't teach critical race theory in schools. In Unitarian Universalism, we have our own version of people who somehow want to deny the reality that race is used to oppress people. And to me, again, it kind of harkens back to the pushback against the words white supremacy culture. So I want to be clear with folks that this is happening within Unitarian Universalism as well. And it's important that we have a working understanding of what critical race theory is to be centered in our values. It's important that we understand critical race theory is important and real, so we can know how to begin to dismantle these systems.
And Aisha, let me speak to that, right? Because I think one of the things that we get confused, and I see this in how folks within our movement are kind of responding to. And I'm going to break this in two parts, right? One, there's a particular streak that is still so maybe unconscious in people's mind of that harkens back to the McCarthy era, right? Anytime you mention Marxism, right, or Marxist tool of analysis, etc., there's a particular kind of reaction, right? That means that you're going to be communist, etc., right? And we know all the problems of real manifested communists, right, and communism. And I think for me that's kind of intriguing, right? Because even if you were to be a Marxist, and even within Marxist studies, right, you make a distinction between Marxism as a tool of analysis, right, and actually what happens when it gets instantiated in public, and the ways in which, ideology, personality, greed, etc., right, gets a play into that, right? So folks can separate that. But in the American public, right, if you use Marxist tool that you're thinking and critiquing capitalism, therefore you're a communist and was bad, right? And that's a default. And I start there because part of the challenge, I think, in our culture is that every time that you engage liberalism, right, and you try to engage it critically, then you have to be a Marxist, right, or you have to be a communist. And it's like, well, that's not true, right? It is important to understand that, critical race theory is really happening and engaging, right, the construction of the law in our liberal system, right? Because our liberal system implies neutrality, right, that everybody gets to do the same thing, and it really implies individualism, right? There are things that are rooted, and for us, right, that is really important. The same thing as democracy, right? That the participation of one person, one vote, right? But the liberal system, and I think we can see this in the challenges, right, that Republicans are doing, right, to voting rights, right? This is part of the function of liberalism, right? That you can restrict voters' right, because within the liberal, and I think what we need to understand, the liberalism as an ideology implies that not everybody belongs. When you can make these challenges, right, that means that some folks, or people of color, are not considered truly human and truly individual. We're considered that by law. And because it is a law, we can be removed, right, from that in practice at any moment. And that's what we see in some of these challenges. So within our movement, I would say that's often what's happening, right? So liberalism, for example, one of the biggest theories of liberal justice, John Rawls, right, the way he makes the system work is that the assumption that we all have to stand behind a veil of ignorance, that we don't know our social location, we don't know our gender, we don't know nothing, and then we decided how society is going to be organized, and then it's fair because we are behind that veil, we remove that veil, and then the chips may fall as they may. And it's like, well, we know in practice that's not how things work, right? In the real world. So that notion of liberalism then is problematic. And I think that's what our folks are struggling with, right? Democracy is good, individualism is good, neutrality is good. If we challenge that, it doesn't happen. It's also the case that a lot of our folks saw themselves really active in the civil rights movement, right? But there's a historical amnesia, right, that I like to point out. And it's like, if the civil rights movement was so successful, why do we have the late 60s and the 70s, right? What happened then? And the big pushback that started to roll back civil liberties right after, right? Those two things are not disconnected from one another, right? Instead, they go together. And we like to forget, we march with King, right? But we forget everything else, right, that happens after King, right? The big repression, right? The big changes of law, right? I mean, the northern cities were a lot more segregated in some ways in education, right, than some of the other cities in the South, right?
Can I real quick, because someone asked a question that I want to address in a meta way. Can you help me understand why some people of color object to critical race theory? I countered this in my work locally. So here's the thing. Yep. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are not a monolith. So you would have to ask the people who are saying they object to critical race theory why. There is no, why do some BIPOC folks support the right? I don't know. I would have to ask them personally. So that I just want to name that there is no monolith. All white people, all Black people, all Indigenous people, all Arab people, etc., and so forth, do not feel the same way about anything. So you would have to ask personally when someone says, I don't like this thing, you can ask them and then they will let you know why.
Right. I like to, this is going to sound kind of funny, but at times the way that I try to explain that distinction is that I want folks to think about the show Boondocks and the comic strip, right? You have Robert Freeman, right, who is a very light-skinned Black person who really makes a living and an ability to subsist and thrive by trying to be integrationist, right? Proximity to whiteness as much as possible is the thing that get them, right? Huey is kind of the Blackness that is a political consciousness, right? A political project, right? And therefore, Huey is pushing, right, the boundaries of what does it mean to be an integrationist. It doesn't really work, right, for us. And then Riley has a more kind of cultural blackness, right, that is more about, you know, fame and fun and pop. And Huey, right, is in between both those two blacknesses, right, and trying to push one and the other. So I think within people of color, right, you're going to have a divergence of opinion, right, and some of it may be, right, with how we are navigating in integrationist politics, right, versus a more kind of grounded political project within the Black freedom struggle, right? That's going to make a difference. Personal experience, right? I think some folks who grew up maybe within a mostly, you know, white neighborhood, right, and with the close relationship are white, might not consider themselves as part of the Black political project, right? And their understanding is going to be different, right, and how they interacted. And even within experiences with the police and others, they might say, this is one and off with that one particular person, right? Versus for me, I have the common sense that when I move to a white neighborhood, I bring pictures of my family to the police station and introduce myself, right? Because I know at some point I'm going to get stopped.
So I want to just thank you for talking about the boondocks, because for me, and the things, so I've understood all the things you said up to this point, but it didn't get that click kind of Tetris moment in my brain till you brought up the boondocks. But because that's who I am. But I think something you said is really important, that there's this variance of Blackness, there's this variance in political engagement, and there's a variance in how folks perceive themselves in the context of the world. And there's also another layer around proximity to whiteness and benefiting from that proximity or being harmed by that proximity, right? So this is like a sphere and a layer cake and a bowling ball, right? It's not one thing. So for the person who asked the question, and as we move forward in this dialogue, really just trying to remember that that for me, what I'm hearing is that this is a lens. Just like if you own a camera, if you take a picture on an iPhone, it's going to look different than an Android, than if you use a standard camera, than if you use a tripod. It doesn't mean you all have a bad picture or an inappropriate picture. It just means we have different lenses. And I feel like what I'm hearing is critical race theory is a lens by which you can look. It is not the only lens, it is a lens. And it's just a way to gain perspective around what's happening to us and how we're being in the world. And so my question is, why are folks afraid of that? Why are folks afraid of various lenses?
Yeah, I think, you know, I will start answering that by saying that one of the basic tenets of critical race theory is that, you know, race and racism in the United States is not abnormal. It is the normal, right? We race and racialize every day, and this is the way that we have constructed our society, and we have organized our work in that particular way, right? There's a particular reason why if you submit an application with a white-sounding name, but you have the wrong quote-unquote zip code, right? Or the wrong zip code and the right name, you might not get a call back. There's a particular reason for that, and it works, right, in the United States more than any other place in the world, maybe not South Africa, right? But I think part of the problem is that we want to see ourselves as a colorblind society, right? That is part of liberalism. Colorblindness implies neutrality, but you can be colorblind really if you're white, right? Because you have that privilege of, I mean, there's a philosopher that calls some white privileged positions of knowing the world, right, can thrive if you really embrace ignorance, right? The thing that anything that doesn't fit your parameters doesn't count as real knowledge, right? It's not part of how the world actually functions, regardless of the evidence, right? So you can push that. So I think within our context, part of the problem is that we still having, as in the society in the US and as a movement, a hard time to really engage with racism. Right. I think that at the bottom line, that's what it is, right? Because if we really admit that we have a race and racism problem, right, then it is a myth that our civil rights process have actually failed, right? And our aspirations are part of our question, right? The inherent worth and dignity, right, of humanity's question. And actually, let me say something about that. We get that concept from Immanuel Kant, the human dignity. Now, here's a problem with that. When Kant talks about human dignity and how that applies, right, to moral subjects, he's very, very clear to also talk about friendship, right? So that is to say, that applies to you if you are in a relationship of friendship, right? If you're not a friend, That doesn't apply, right? That's why he can do other things, right, and justify colonialism out of the pieces, right? Because in that notions of humanity, you have to be a friend. And I think we forget that, right? Human dignity must not apply to everyone, right? Or you have John Locke, right, talking about baptism, right? When indentured servants who were Irish were baptized, they became brothers in Christ, but also brothers in society. They were given equal rights, right? They didn't have equal rights, they were given rights. For Black folks and slave folks, baptism make you a Christian, but it doesn't abolish your state as property and grant you rights, right? And John Locke actually helped write the Virginia Constitution to make that argument, to make that legal, right? And then it applied. So we can see how then that law was used to some white folks who were considered, right, less than at the moment, because of being indentured servants, were able to kind of grandfather into the rights, but others were grandfather, quote unquote, into Christian brotherhood, right, but not as a civil subject, right? They will steal, right?
Well, John Locke was racist AF. I mean, you know, these people you're talking about were super hella racist. So just to be clear, I need to throw that.
Right. No, and again, when we think John Locke is connected to how we think about private property, right, and central to part of the ways in which we understand legal rights, right? It's embedded, right? It's connected to one another. And he's thinking about the second treatise as he's writing about private property. He's in the islands in the Caribbean, right? When British subjects are thinking, what does it mean to own people, right? Indian workers, right, and Black slaves, and what does it mean, right? Not to be landed, but have enough money and property that you can then make a case, right, for citizenship and rights.
Well, isn't it the law is not property? What is it? Ownership is 9/10 of the law, or some shit like that. What's the phrase? So, and now let's connect this to police who are there to protect property. Our whole system of incarceration and law enforcement is there to protect.
Don't bring it around with that hot cup of tea, Aisha. You coming around full circle with a hot cup of tea.
You know, and I want to say something else. One of the interesting things to me, right, is that they are word phrases and phrases that function in some people's mind as conversation stopper, right? So white supremacy culture. Once you say that, you're calling me all kinds of things, I'm not gonna have the conversation. Interesting, if you don't use that language, right, white supremacy culture, and still are having the conversation, you will get the same reaction from people, right? Because it is a matter of thinking about power and privilege that you will have to give up. I say, like, you know, one of the things that I tell my students, I'm a sociologist who works in classical theory, right? The all white folks who are dead, is that I can get you to the same spot, right, doing that work, right, and you still, then you cannot say that I'm being racist, that I'm baiting you anything, right? We're talking about the economics, how society is organized, how this is working in the world, right? And I think that's part of our problem, right? We don't want to get there, and we use some of the languages, right, to fight back and find that as an excuse, right, to have some of the deep, meaningful conversation. And also understanding that folks who are most impacted, right, by this event, right, will have something to say about that experience, right, that may not fit the parameters, right, of the more privileged subjects. So therefore, they have to learn something new, right? They have to grow. They have to practice intellectual humility, right, and be in conversation and learn. And sometimes that's difficult for some folks. And some of our folks, that's really difficult.
So it's about 12:43. So I want to bring us back around. I want to make sure that you cover some of the things. I can tell you have a list because I know you. Is there things that you wanted to cover or make sure that we come back around to before we have to kind of start to wrap up a little bit? This is such a heavy topic, so I want to make sure we bullet point what we can.
Yeah, you know, I think some of the things to say is, and I'm thinking directly to our movement, right? One of the things that I find puzzling, right, is that we want to take our congregations, and particularly Sunday, to be the laboratory of what does it mean, right, to be a racial justice world and society. But most of our life is lived segregated, right? So what does it mean that we can feel comfortable in practice in our life, segregated lives, right? And yet expect Sunday, right, to be a space of, you know, racial harmony and haven, in which everything goes well, right? I think we need to start practicing in our own lives, right? What does it mean to be in deep relationship, right, across the race and gender spectrum, if we want to make then Sunday something different? And I think in our community, we want to do it the other way around, right? Sundays, you think. And what that oftentimes means is that we do cosmetic changes, right? Singing a hymn in Spanish, particularly a hymn that folks don't even know where it's come from, right? It's a challenge, right? Or assuming that a particular, I'm thinking in our hymno de colores, right? I'm not Catholic, right? So that hymn doesn't mean much to me, even though I'm fluent in Spanish, right? If you don't understand the connection between that hymn and Catholic Crusader practices in resistance to the Franco regime and others, then we have that problem, right? Most folks think this is a Mexican song. No, right? It is not. But the fact that we sing it, then I'm already offended, right? Because you don't even understand where it's come from. I have no place, and you sing it because you think you're doing something special for folks like me. Right? You say, well, no, right? And I say that as a segue that if our communities really want to start moving into that process, right, of becoming racial justice focused and transforming ourselves, we also have to be comfortable with understanding the necessity to create within our systems and our communities, right, spaces that prioritize people of color and spaces that are only for people of color within our spaces. And that's not about being, segregationist and being divisive, et cetera, right? It is about prioritizing the needs of a particular community until we start doing the larger change that needs to happen, right? That change cannot come, right, at our cost and well-being. And I think that's been part of the challenge that I also find many of our movement find really uncomfortable, right? That we don't know how to get there. And it makes us feel really, really uncomfortable to be in that space.
Stitcheroo in our chat asks if there are good basic reading source recommendations that they can peruse at their own pace, because people have noted that this show has been an entire course in political theory and philosophy, and some of us are totally geeking out on this, and some of us are a little overwhelmed, and we'd love to leave our viewers with some places to go to find out more. Do you have some suggestions?
Actually, yes. There is so much, right, to find now. I think right now there's been an explosion, right, of kind of popular essays, right, on what's going on with critical theory and why folks are resisting it. Linda Martí-Alcoff, and I can send that link in a moment, recently wrote a wonderful piece, right, about what critical race theory is. There's another piece that got published, I think, in Inside Higher Ed, about kind of how some philanthropists are funding, right, particular kind of resistance through colleges, universities, and other spaces, right, to make a particular kind of move, right, against the conversation about race. Right? And I think we know what happened with the 1619 project, right, and the whole reaction, right, about that project. And behind that, right, there's a good group of right philanthropists, right, trying to push on that. I think there's also a distinction that we need to make about what is intellectual work and what is not intellectual work. Right, thinking hard for 6 months and writing a self-published book is not academic work, is not research, is not validated by the peers in the field, right? That is really a pamphlet, right? And of course, that I'm not saying that things like that does not deserve reading and conversation, right? But we need to understand what that means in connection, right, with academic that spend 3, 4, 5 years researching, right, a particular kind of issue, right, to write something.
Or 50 years.
Yes.
I mean, right.
And it goes through the processes, right? And I think we need to be aware and mindful, right, of that, and what does it mean? And our folks are highly educated folks by and large. We pride ourselves as a movement to be highly educated. That's a little bit of research.
And I think that it's super important to make that distinction and say there is nothing wrong with somebody coming up with a firsthand, here's how I experienced X, Y, or Z. And that is a different kind of exercise than something that is researched, that is peer reviewed, that is, those are different things. And it doesn't necessarily mean that one has more value than the other, but it does mean that you can't necessarily compare the two, right? On the same basis. And I think one of the things that I'd like our viewers to hear is that particularly as it relates to Unitarian Universalism. Because let's be real, right now there is a really deep pushback against quote unquote critical race theory in Unitarian Universalism. And the one of the main thrusts behind that pushback is that somehow it's divisive and somehow it's making it harder for us to reconcile to each other or be together in all of this. And I think it's really crucial to me that folks understand that it is not critical race theory in itself that is divisive. It is not the idea that we are looking at Unitarian Universalism from the perspective of race that is making it divisive. It is a society that we already live in that is already racially segregated, in which one portion of that population doesn't have to acknowledge or admit that.
Let me give an example of something really intriguing for me that happened in Arizona, the state of Arizona. And there was a fight against closing some ethnic studies curriculum in schools, right? And I think we need to put in the context, before ethnic curriculum started in school, among people of color, there was a high dropout rate, over 50%. And for white folks, there was a significant dropout rate too, not as high, but enough, right, to do that. There was also a big kind of emptying of town as a youth, right, left town because there was no possibilities. Shortly after that, the ethnic study starting to become part of the curriculum in high schools, right, the things starting to change and into college, right? So there was an increased number of students of color graduating, and also white students are performing better, getting into college, graduating and returning back, right, into the community as educators and others, right? And we saw that impact. However, the argument in the legislature in Arizona is like they're teaching the kids to hate, right, America, right, to hate the law because they're being really critical. They push as a law, moved ethnic study, close them down, and then we're back, right, worse than we were before, right? And I think that's interesting. It's like, so the problem is that folks who are succeeding, right, the community that you wanted to see kind of either leave town, right, or be underemployed, undereducated, is succeeding, it's returning back and making an impact. And that is really what is motivating you, right, to make the push.
I've been reading a book, and I just want to check in to make sure that this is. It seems like it's in the third edition. It's Delgado and Stefanchich. It's Critical Race Theory and Introduction. It's a classic. Okay, I've been reading that, and it's again it's one of those, like, read for a while and then go hold my head and try and absorb it all, and then come back and read for a while and then go hold my head. And one of the things that really struck me in this was what you talked about with the pushback, and how the pushback is not always big trucks with offensive stickers and flags and all that other stuff. The resistance to justice is a really specific and really narrow interpretation of the good laws that have been passed. And it reminds me of what we do with grammar at the denominational level when we have a large statement of values. When we have a big statement of the action of immediate witness, right? We have this statement of force and righteousness and morality and what is just in the world. And then we take it to GA and we take it apart, comma by semicolon by adverb. And because that seems to be the way that, and I'm going to use a broad brush here, white liberals protect ourselves from actually having to change.
It's a strategy, yeah.
But without being actually outwardly saying, this is uncomfortable for me and I don't like it.
Mm-hmm. Our denomination has been making statements and calls to immediate witness since the 60s, right, on this topic. If you go to the UUA, right, and type, racial justice or race statements, you're going to find a lot, right? This is not new within our movement. and it's being resisted, right, at every turn of the event. And I think that's part of the question that we have to ask ourselves. You know, a movement that prides itself, a faith movement to pride itself about being justice seeking and justice making, yet we have a really, 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 really hard time, right, to working and dealing with racism. It's a question for me about what's going on among ourselves. That is the case. And I think, let me say something else. One of the things that I find problematic too is that just because your analysis in other areas of social justice may be correct and appropriate, does not mean, right, that your analysis in others can be incorrect, right? Because it can be, right? You can be a very successful, maybe, gender equity advocate, and you can be a very horrible, right, ally in terms of racial justice, right? And not to say the intersectionality of race and gender, right? And I think we tend to kind of take kudos for one and forget that expertise in one area does not get it done. You know, I am a doctor, quote unquote, but I'm not a surgeon, quote unquote, right? That's the difference. Different doctors.
So I wanted to, as we lean into this last 5 minutes, I guess for me, one of my questions is, what is next? After we have this conversation, this debate, and we come to a better understanding of what the argument is about, on top and underneath, because it's a iceberg topic, right? We talk about something on the surface, but there's a lot underneath. What comes next? How do we continue to ways that affirm what we believe to be true, which is that race does influence everything?
Yeah, you know, I think speaking in our movement, I would say the first things that we really need to engage is that we need to start taking covenant seriously. And that is to say, we cannot treat our covenants the same way that we treat prenups, right? I think our covenanting practice is oftentimes a prenup agreement of all the things that we are not, right, going to abide by, etc., instead of a commitment of how are we going to be at the faith community to one another, right, in the presence of the holy known by many names. And I think that would be a good start for us to really take covenanting seriously, right, as a faith community. And not only, and I think to get an understanding that when we covenant, right, we're not only covenanting in our particular church, congregation, fellowship with our friends, where we're making a promise, right, as a people who believe in the good news of Unitarian Universalism, right? So we're covenanting, right, with a larger body of faith. I think that's going to be a first big step, right, for us. If we really want to engage racism, we really need to think about that.
And I think that if we're going to truly get deep and real about how we are called to be with one another, how we are called to relate to one another, how we are called to build relationships with one another, then we have to address what happens when we're building relationships across identities and across power dynamics, because those things are real in our society. So we have to be real about that. It is 12:58, and if you have a last word, we would love to hear it.
Well, you know, I think this is meaningful work that we really have to engage. And I'm going to close. Edwidge Dandicat, who is a Haitian American writer, in one of her essays, she coined this phrase for artists, right, immigrant artists. And she urges immigrant artists to really create boldly, because somehow, somebody may risk their life to engage with your work, right? And your work can be life-saving, right? So that's why you do it, because it can be life-saving for somebody. You might not even know it, but it could be. And I think for us, that's part of the reality. Can we engage this work of transformation in our communities towards racial justice, right? Because life depends on it, right? I think that would be my last word.
Thank you so very much. It has been such a pleasure to have you here for this hour. This could have been a 9-hour show, and maybe you'll come back in the fall and talk some more about some topics. We hope you will. And next week, our last show of the season, we are welcoming the Article 2 Study Commission onto our show. So if you thought that we went deep this week, We're doing it again. We're doing it again next week, talking about Article 2, the principles and sources and purposes of our association and how they change over time with the commission that has been asked to propose those changes. So
Eat your Wheaties, kids.
that's right. And we will see you next Thursday at noon Eastern, 9 Pacific. And that time won't change. Be well.